again, one of the better received critically of my.
It began with a whisper, not a headline. At 80, Sydney Pollack's widow finally broke her silence. Sitting in a quiet Los Angeles living room surrounded by old film reels and the faint smell of celluloid, she said softly to the journalist recorder, "There were things only Bob could reach in Sydney." For a moment, the air thickened. She wasn't talking about gossip or scandal, but about something more elusive, more dangerous, intimacy of the soul. For decades, Robert Redford and Sydney Pollack had been described as the golden pair of American cinema, the actor and the director who understood each other without words. From Jeremiah Johnson to Out of Africa, their partnership had created an entire mythology of masculine solitude and moral beauty. Yet behind the perfection of those frames, behind the lens and the light, there was a secret rhythm that few ever noticed, the rhythm of two men bound by art, loyalty, and the haunting fear of being alone. When the journalist asked Pollack's widow if she ever felt jealous of that connection, she smiled, not bitterly, but with the tenderness of someone who had accepted the truth long ago. "I used to call Robert his second heartbeat," she said. It wasn't just collaboration. It was something that blurred boundaries, friendship as devotion, rivalry as mirror, silence as confession. In Hollywood, where relationships burn fast and loyalties fade under the spotlight, theirs endured for 40 years. But what does such endurance cost? How much of oneself must be given away to create something immortal, even now? Redford rarely speaks about Pollack without his voice tightening. He calls him the only director who ever saw me completely. And yet, after Pollack's death in 2008, Redford didn't attend public tributes or interviews. He disappeared into the mountains of Utah, the same landscape where their first great film had begun. Maybe that's where the truth still lingers, in the wind over the canyons, in the silence between camera clicks, in the unspoken understanding that some loves are not romantic, but they leave a wound all the same. Because every genius partnership hides a secret. And sometimes, the greatest truth in Hollywood isn't what's filmed, but what was never said. When This Property is Condemned was released in 1966, few could have guessed it marked the beginning of one of Hollywood's most mysterious partnerships. Robert Redford was still the handsome idealist. The quiet storm behind the blue eyes, Sydney Pollack was the intellectual craftsman, a director obsessed with rhythm, silence, and emotional truth. They met not through ambition, but through recognition. Each saw in the other a reflection of his own unspoken hunger to turn life into cinema, and cinema into confession. Their first collaborations were raw, almost instinctive. Pollack would walk behind the camera, pacing like a conductor searching for the right tempo. Redford would stand under the light, saying less and meaning more. When they shot Jeremiah Johnson on the snowy slopes of Utah, the crew watched in awe as they built scenes with almost telepathic coordination. Pollack once said, half smiling, "We didn't talk. We just breathed in the same direction." It was a partnership that elevated both men. Pollack gave Redford dimension. He pulled the myth out of the man. Redford gave Pollack mystery. He lent the director his face, his silence, his restraint. Together, they invented a new kind of masculinity for American cinema, intelligent, wounded, moral, and alone. By the time The Way We Were arrived in 1973, their chemistry had matured into legend. Pollack's camera lingered on Redford not as an idol, but as a question: what does it mean to be good in a world built on compromise? Every shot felt like a quiet argument between them, a debate between faith and doubt. We were searching for truth and beauty, Pollack later confessed, And sometimes beauty won. They understood each other's rhythms the way musicians do through trust. On 3 days of the Condor, that trust was tested by paranoia, both on-screen and off. Hollywood was changing. The optimism of the 1,960 seconds had turned into the cynicism of Watergate, and their films mirrored it. Pollack pushed Redford harder, asking him to explore suspicion, fear, the weight of conscience. Redford resisted, but he obeyed. In the final cut, the tension between them became the soul of the film. Then came the Electric Horseman, and something shifted. Redford was now a star, a producer, the face of American integrity. Pollack, still the perfectionist, began to feel the imbalance of fame. Their conversations grew shorter, their silences longer. Yet even when they disagreed, their creative pulse remained in sync. They fought like brothers. One crew member recalled, but they finished each other's sentences in the edit room. The world saw success Oscars, box office triumphs, magazine covers. But behind the curtain, there was an invisible cord pulling at both men. The illusion of perfection was their greatest performance, two artists pretending not to need each other when, in truth, each was terrified of losing the other's gaze. Then, in 1985, Out of Africa sealed their legend. Pollack directed it like a love letter, vast, elegant, melancholic. Redford, as Denise Finch Hatton, became his muse once again. The film wasn't just about romance between man and woman. It was about the distance between two souls, chasing meaning in a world of beauty and decay. Watching it now, one can almost feel Pollack filming Redford the way a painter studies a fading light, afraid that one day it won't return. When Out of Africa won 7 Oscars, Redford stood quietly in the audience as Pollack accepted his award. The camera caught his face for just a second, proud, but distant, as if the victory belonged to a memory he already missed. That was the peak of their cinematic marriage, and also the beginning of its slow unraveling. After Havana in 1990, the magic started to dissolve. Hollywood had changed again. The industry no longer had patience for long, contemplative films. Pollack moved toward producing, Redford toward directing. They were still bound by admiration, but the creative electricity had cooled. What remained was something rarer, a friendship made of respect, fatigue, and ghosts. People around them said they could go months without speaking, then meet again and resume mid-sentence. Others noticed a quiet melancholy whenever Redford spoke of Pollack, a look that said, "We built something beautiful, but we built it on time, borrowed from life." For 40 years, the world believed their partnership was built on confidence, control, and artistic perfection. But beneath that illusion, there was dependency, the kind that binds two souls too closely for comfort. Pollack once joked that directing Redford was like trying to capture a reflection. You get it for a second, and then it vanishes. Yet perhaps that was why he kept filming him, to hold, for one more frame, the mystery that defined them both. Their perfect illusion had created cinema that outlived them. But illusions, even the most luminous, demand payment. As the lights dimmed on their final collaboration, each man began to realize the truth. Pollack's wife would later confess that their connection was too deep, too silent, and too necessary to survive unscarred. It is impossible to understand what bound them together without first understanding what separated them from the world. Both Robert Redford and Sydney Pollack were men raised on silence, men who learned early that emotions were a private language, not to be spoken aloud but translated into work. For Redford, that silence came from grief, the loss of a child, the weight of expectation, the quiet punishment of fame. For Pollack, it was born of ambition, the endless noise of Hollywood that he drowned out through discipline and control. When their paths crossed, the silence of one met the structure of the other, and something clicked. They began to speak through images, through fragments of light, through the stillness between two lines of dialogue. In that silent language, there was trust but also dependence. Pollack once wrote in a margin of his script, "Bob gives me balance. Without him, I drift toward intellect. With him, I remember to feel." Redford, in his own private notes, described Pollack as the mirror that forces me to look. What began as collaboration evolved into something far more personal, an emotional alliance that neither could explain, much less control. After Out of Africa, they drifted apart publicly. But in truth, their separation was more spiritual than physical. Pollack struggled with the industry's shift toward commercialism. He felt cinema losing its soul, its patience, its intimacy. Redford, meanwhile, turned inward, founding Sundance, mentoring young directors, searching for meaning outside the machinery of fame. Yet every time he stepped behind a camera, traces of Pollack were there, the measured pacing, the love for natural light, the insistence on quiet revelation. Behind the scenes, there were signs of exhaustion, not from animosity, but from emotional gravity. Pollack once confessed to a friend that he felt haunted by Redford's silence. He meant it literally. During The Electric Horseman, he had learned to read the small movements in Redford's face, a blink, a sigh, a pause before speech, as if they were musical notes. That sensitivity, that attunement, was exhilarating at first. But as years passed, it became a burden. To direct someone so intimately was to expose oneself, to hold up a mirror to one's own fragility. Redford, for his part, found himself weighed down by the same intimacy. He admired Pollack's perfectionism but feared being consumed by it. Sydney wanted to reach the core of everything. He said years later, "But sometimes the core is just emptiness." That line, .com, almost cruel, reveals the essence of their bond, love and fatigue intertwined. They needed each other, but they also needed space to breathe. When Pollack was diagnosed with cancer, Redford did not rush to his side. That decision puzzled those around him. But those who knew him best understood. His absence was not indifference, it was reverence. He didn't want Pollack to see the pity in his eyes. He preferred to remember the man behind the camera, fierce and alive, shouting directions over the wind in Utah. And Pollack, even in his illness, never asked for visits. Their friendship had been built on silence. It would end the same way. In his final months, Pollack worked on The Interpreter and a handful of smaller projects. The illness slowed him down, but his mind stayed sharp. He reportedly kept a framed photo of Jeremiah Johnson on his desk, Redford, half hidden in snow, staring into the horizon. When a visitor asked why that image, Pollack smiled faintly, because that's what he looks like when he's alone. That's how I always saw him. Redford, meanwhile, began preparing Lions for Lambs, his own directorial project about moral courage and disillusionment, themes Pollack had once urged him to explore. Watching the film today, it feels like a quiet conversation between two men who could no longer speak. Redford's tone is reflective, almost apologetic, as if he were responding to Pollack's lifelong question, can we still believe in decency when the world rewards compromise? When Pollack passed away in 2008, the public tributes were full of warmth and nostalgia. But Redford remained silent. No statement. No interviews. Only a brief message released through his foundation. He was my friend, my collaborator, my compass. 3 words: friend, collaborator, compass, each carrying the weight of 40 years. In private, those who knew Redford at Sundance that summer said he was unusually quiet. He spent long hours walking alone around the lake. One night, he returned to an empty screening room and watched out of Africa in the dark, without sound. When the scene of Meryl Streep and Redford flying over the savannah appeared, he reportedly whispered, "That was Sydney's dream, not mine." No one knows exactly what he meant. Maybe that cinema itself had been Pollack's great romance, and Redford, the actor, had merely been the vessel. The hidden truth of their story is not scandal, nor rivalry, but something more fragile: dependence as devotion. For 40 years, they used film to translate what neither could say: that art, at its purest, is a form of love. But love, even in its most spiritual form, exhausts. It consumes. It demands that one man give shape to another's silence, and that the other bear the weight of being understood too deeply. After Pollack's death, Redford continued to make films, but the tone changed. They became quieter, lonelier, stripped of sentimentality. It was as if the lens itself had grown heavier, missing the steadying hand that once guided it. Interviews from that period reveal a man who speaks of time, loss, and truth the way a widower might speak of his late wife, tenderly, but without illusion. Sometimes, the price of intimacy is not betrayal or heartbreak, but endurance, the long ache of surviving the one person who truly saw you. For Redford, every frame he shot afterward carried that ache. The wind in his later films feels colder, the pauses longer. Even his smile, once effortless, seems tinged with memory. Perhaps that is the real legacy of Sydney Pollack, not the awards, nor the critical acclaim, but the mark he left on Redford's silence. Together, they built a myth of American manhood that was tender yet stoic, heroic yet haunted. And when the myth ended, what remained was the loneliness of truth, that 2 men had loved the same language so deeply, it became impossible to speak it alone. Because in the end, the hidden truth wasn't in the films. It was in the spaces between them, in the unspoken gestures, the patient gaze, the shared obsession with beauty and meaning. It was in the realization that art could be both sanctuary and prison, and that no camera, however perfect, could capture the moment when creation turns into loss. The revelation did not come from Robert Redford. It came from the one person who had lived longest in the shadow of their friendship, Sydney Pollack's wife. In a quiet interview marking the anniversary of her husband's death, she opened a worn notebook that had sat untouched for years in a drawer beside his desk. Inside were fragments of speeches, handwritten notes for interviews he never gave, and a single letter addressed to no one. She read aloud, "There is a part of me that only Bob understood. I fought it, denied it, tried to contain it in our work. But every film we made was a conversation between what I feared and what he already knew." Her voice trembled. "I don't think he ever sent it," she said. "Maybe it wasn't meant to be sent." That letter, now faded and fragile, revealed what decades of speculation never could, that their connection was not about control or power, but recognition, the rare, almost terrifying intimacy of 2 minds mirroring each other too precisely. In a world where every partnership in Hollywood was built on transaction, theirs had been built on surrender. Pollack's widow spoke without bitterness. "People always ask if I was jealous," she said. "But what would there be to envy? They needed each other in a way that didn't belong to anyone else. It wasn't love, But it was more than friendship. It was a marriage of vision. The phrase lingered, a marriage of vision. She explained that when Sydney came home from set, he was often quiet, emptied out. I could always tell when He'd been filming with Bob. She said, he carried a kind of peace with him and a sadness, too, as if He'd looked at something pure and already lost it. Among Pollack's papers, there was also a page from a speech he had planned for a Lifetime Achievement Award, never delivered. One line stood out in his neat handwriting. There's a man who understands my blind spots and guards them. No name followed, none was needed. The discovery struck something tender in Redford when he heard of it years later. According to a journalist who contacted him for comment, he stayed silent for a long moment and then said simply, he never had to write that. I already knew. That was the essence of their bond, words unsaid, meaning shared in the quiet space between them. Redford had never spoken publicly about Pollack's death beyond a few restrained remarks. But those who knew him understood that his mourning had no language. He carried it instead in gestures, in the choice of projects that reflected their old themes of loyalty, solitude, and the moral weight of time. And so, the biggest shock was not the letter itself, but the realization that Pollack had seen Redford not as an actor or muse, but as an extension of his own moral landscape, the human embodiment of everything he tried to capture on film. Redford was his question, his conscience, his reflection. In the last months of Pollack's life, when he was too weak to direct, he reportedly told a colleague, Bob will understand what to do next. He wasn't speaking of a project, but of something deeper, the unspoken continuation of a shared vision. After his passing, Redford quietly acquired the rights to several of Pollack's notes and unfinished ideas. None were ever filmed. Perhaps he didn't need to. Perhaps completing them would have been a kind of betrayal, an intrusion into something sacred. Instead, he carried those ghosts into his own late films, shaping them with the restraint and melancholy that had defined Pollack's best work. Watching Redford in those later years, in All Is Lost. In The Old Man and the Gun, one can sense the invisible presence of Pollack. Every pause, every careful frame, every choice to let silence speak feels like a conversation resumed across time. In the end, the revelation wasn't about hidden love or scandal. It was about recognition, the moment one artist looks at another and sees himself reflected back. Older, truer, unguarded. Few people experience that even once in a lifetime. They did, for 40 years. And that, perhaps, is why Redford has never tried to replace him. Some partnerships end because they break, others, because they complete. Pollack's widow said one last thing before the interview ended. She looked at the old reels stacked behind her and whispered, when I watch their films now, I don't see actors or directors. I see two men who trusted each other too much to lie. And that, finally, was the truth, the one that had waited patiently in silence, until time itself gave it permission to be heard. In the end, there are stories that live beyond applause, stories that don't fade with the credits, but echo in the silence afterward. The partnership of Robert Redford and Sydney Pollack was one of those stories. It began as art, became devotion, and ended as something that words could never quite define. What they built together was more than a filmography. It was a shared vocabulary for truth. Hollywood loves to mythologize, to call things friendship, genius, destiny. But theirs was quieter, more human. It was two men discovering that understanding another person completely can be both a gift and a wound. Every camera angle, every moment of restraint, every unspoken look was their way of asking the same question. Can two souls meet without losing themselves? Pollack's death left that question unanswered. And perhaps that is the point. Because in art, as in love, completion is not the goal. Continuity is. Each of Redford's later films carries Pollack's shadow like a watermark, unseen but essential. The slowness of a scene, the pause before a line, the tenderness toward solitude, these are traces of a dialogue that never ended. Looking back now, what stands out is not tragedy, but faith. Faith in art as a bridge between lone linuses. Faith in loyalty as a form of courage. In a world addicted to noise, they chose silence, and in that silence, they built something eternal. Their friendship reminds us that love has many languages. Some are spoken, others are filmed. The greatest ones are simply lived quietly, steadfastly, without explanation. Maybe that's why Redford has never tried to define it. Because to define something sacred is to diminish it. He once said, almost to himself, Sydney is still here in the spaces. And perhaps that is where all great loves remain, not in the spotlight, but in the spaces between light and shadow, between the end of one sentence and the beginning of another. Because when the camera stops rolling, what endures isn't fame or perfection. It's the silent truth, two souls carried together through 40 years of light.